Star Trek Prodigy, A Dangerous Game. Chapter 9. The ground vehicle zoomed through the trees, heading in the direction of the protostar. Dal was driving, his fingers poised over the controls as he zoomed down the path. Maybe slow down? Jankum clung to the side of the vehicle, his eyes wide. You almost hit that, Dal wrenched the vehicle away from a low-hanging tree branch at the last minute, sending everyone in the vehicle careening off to one side and setting off a chorus of protests. Sorry, Dal said, whipping the vehicle in the other direction. But Talus and her scavenging crew could be stripping our ship as we speak. He glanced at Jankum. At least I have a reason for driving like a maniac. I did leave the deflector shields up, Gwyn shouted from the back seat. They have a way of getting through those. The vehicle's console map beeped. Dal glanced down to see they were approaching the protostar's location. He slowed down. Oh, thank goodness, Zero said. I was afraid I was going to get flung out the back window. Hey, I got us here in record time. Dal grinned and drew up on the controls, holographic lights fluttering around his fingers. Slowly, the vehicle came to a stop near a particularly wide tree. Where's the ship? Rock Talk asked, worry in her voice. Just up ahead. We'll walk the rest of the way so the traders don't hear our vehicle. Dal shut off the vehicle's power and jumped out, landing softly on the spongy forest floor. He tilted his head, listening. It was quiet out here among the trees, save for the rushing of the wind in the branches, the babble of the nearby river, and voices. I hear them, Gwyn said softly, stepping up alongside Dal. Dal nodded. The voices of the traders came drifting faintly through the forest. He couldn't make out exactly what they were saying, but they sounded excited. Suddenly the quiet was shattered by a loud, grinding whine. Jankum surged forward, his movement frantic. The shields! He cried. That sound is the shields failing! Dal caught Jankum before he ran up any closer to the ship. Failing, he said into Jankum's ear, but not totally depleted, right? Jankum nodded, listening to the loud whine. Yes, he said, but it's close. How close? Gwyn asked. Jankum shook his head. Can't tell from listening. Jankum Pog would need to see the shields to know for sure. Dal nodded. Then we'll get closer. See how much time we have. He glanced back to the crew's worried faces. How are we going to get aboard? Rock Talk said sadly. We still can't use the transporters safely. Once we know how much time we have, we'll figure something out. Dal flashed her a smile that looked braver than he felt. I promise. The crew crept forward through the trees. It wasn't long before Dal saw dots of light glinting through the cool, shadowy green of the forest, the sun bouncing off the protostar's hull. He pulled Jankum alongside him, putting a finger to his lips. What do you want, Jankum? Be quiet, Dal hissed. We're almost there. They crawled through the underbrush, branches snapping around them. Fortunately, the whining of Talus's mobile shield deflector masked most of the noise. Dal paused right at the edge of the underbrush. Through the tangle of greenery, he could see the protostar next to the river, gleaming and unharmed. It was wrapped in a pale white glow, the shields. As Dal watched, the shields flickered once. We're almost there, Talus shouted triumphantly. She looked up from the shield deflector and squinted at the ship. I think 10 more minutes should do the trick. Dal's chest tightened. He glanced over at Jankum, who was staring out at the ship with huge, frightened eyes. Jankum Pog thinks it'll be even less than that, he whispered sadly. Dal stared at the protostar. He and the others had fought so hard for it. Protostar had been the reason they escaped from Tars Lamora in the first place. Then it had become their home among the stars, allowing them to see worlds none of them could ever have dreamed of when they were trapped working under the diviner's cold rule. And now they were about to lose all of it to a gang of traders from some backwater thieves' market. Come on, Dal whispered. Let's go back to the others. Jenkum looked over at Dal in horror. But the shields, he cried. If we don't do something, Talus is going to get through. As he spoke, the shields flickered again. Talus, Chidosa, and Tigras all let out a round of excited whoops. Which is why we're going to do something, Dal said with a smirk. We've got 5 minutes until the shields are drained, Dal announced as he and Jenkum strode into the clearing where the others were waiting. What? Cried Rocktalk. Are you sure? Very sure, Jenkum said sadly. What are we going to do? Gwyn said. Do we want to try the transporters? Nope. Dal grinned at them before slapping his hand down on his communicator badge. Dal to Janeway. Gwyn frowned and glanced questioningly over at Jenkum. He didn't tell Jenkum Pog what he was up to. He's up to something? Zero asked. This is Janeway. Her familiar voice came through Dal's comm badge. I'm glad to hear from you. We have an issue. With the shields, I know. We're all right outside the ship. Then you know who's doing this. It's some rogue traitors. Listen. Dal took a deep breath. Lift the shields. What? Are you serious? Jenkum Pog says that's a terrible idea. Dal held up one hand to silence his friend's protest. Janeway, lift the shields, then deflect all power to the vehicle replicator. Janeway waited a beat before saying, Are you sure those are your orders? Positive. Dal out. He tapped his comm badge and looked at the others, all of whom were utterly baffled by his decision. The vehicle replicator? Jenkum sputtered. From the other side of the trees, the loud whining suddenly cut off. A second later, the traders erupted into victorious cheers. Come on, we need to get to the protostar now, before they board. Get over there. Gwyn stepped forward, shock rippling through her. You want to get captured again? Dal's grin widened. I do. But why? Gwyn shook her head. I just rescued you from them. The voices of the traders carried through the trees, primarily Talus barking orders at Tigras and Chidosa to get their gear together. This is different, Dal said. This time, we're getting captured on purpose. This explanation was met with baffled silence. Is there any way you could explain further? Zero asked, choosing, as he usually did, to stay out of Dal's thoughts. What are you planning to do with the vehicle replicator to begin with? Dal sighed in frustration. Look, we need to surrender before they board the ship, okay? Will you all just trust me? For a moment, no one moved. Then Gwyn stepped forward. Fine, she said. I'll see where this is going. Thank you, Dal grinned. We're not going to get thrown into another cage, I promise. Rocktalk and Zero looked at each other. Rocktalk looked down at Murph, who nodded his head. As long as I don't have to be anyone's bodyguard, Rocktalk sighed. You won't, Dal nodded. Come on, Jenkum. Sure. What else does Jenkum Pog have to lose? He threw his hands up. Just the whole ship! We're not going to lose the ship. Dal turned away from the others and strode toward the protostar. I've got a plan. A few moments later, Dal stepped out of the tree line and along the riverbank where the protostar was waiting. Talus stood with her arms crossed over her chest as Tigras argued with Chidosa over who got to carry the pulse rifle. No one's on that ship, Talus said with a sigh. Could you two just... Hey! Dal shouted. Talus froze, then turned toward Dal. When she saw him and the rest of the crew, she let out a string of words the translator didn't see fit to translate. All Dal heard was, Ugh, Ioma. I wanted to make a deal, Dal said. A real one. Talus smirked, her lip curling up around her tusks. Will you be attempting to trade a bag full of rocks again? Rocktalk glared at Talus. Talus only chuckled, then began striding toward the crew. Dal could sense his crewmates tensing up behind him. Talus, what are you doing? Tigras shouted. These kids aren't going to do anything, even if they aren't locked up. Talus held up one hand, and the Klingon fell silent. She narrowed her eyes at Dal. "He has a point," she said. "We broke through your shields. You have no weapons, and I have one of the greatest fighters on Odaru helping me out. I'm not sure what you think you're accomplishing here." Dal lifted his chin defiantly. "I told you. We're here to make a deal. We surrender." "You surrender?" Talus let out a burst of laughter. "You managed to get away from Ioma, who is admittedly not one of the best fighters on Odaru, just so you can come here and surrender?" Dal felt his chest tighten. He hadn't expected her to protest. But then Gwyn stepped forward. "I rescued them," she said. Talus nodded with something that almost looked like approval. "But we realized after we got away..." Gwyn took a deep breath, glancing sideways at Dal. She only hoped she'd bought him enough time to come up with an excuse. "That we need our ship more than we need anything else." The words came out of Dal's mouth in a rush. "And we've got some top-notch treasures on board. Stuff like this." Gwyn let her heirloom unwrap from her arm, and just as it had captured Ioma's fancy instantly, it also caught Talus's. "What is that?" she breathed. "Just something we found on our travels." Gwyn let the heirloom settle back into a bracelet. "I've got others. If you take us aboard the ship, I'll show you where I store them." "Not to mention the chimerium," Dal added quickly. "You'd be surprised what a group of kids can make off with." Talus cocked her head. "You have chimerium?" Dal nodded. He was distantly aware of Rock Talk wrapping her arm around Jenkum's mouth to keep him from shouting something about how they did not, in fact, have any chimerium. He made a mental note to thank her later. "So why were you trying to trade a battery?" Talus asked, her eyes narrowed. "Why not just buy what you needed?" Dal crossed his arms over his chest. "Well, we assumed it'd be safer to trade the battery rather than cart around the amount of chimerium we'd need. We were wrong, but hey, what can you do?" He grinned. Talus studied him for a long time, then flicked her gaze behind him to Rock Talk and Gwyn and Murph and Jenkum and Zero. Dal held his breath, his heart pounding. "Talus," Chidosa called out, "are we boarding or not?" "We are," Talus called back, "but we have a new plan. No more stripping the ship." She smiled down at Dal, showing all her teeth. "We're going treasure hunting instead." Chapter 10. Zero floated behind Rock Talk, still uncertain what exactly Dal had in mind. Why had he told Talus they had chimerium aboard the ship? And what was Talus going to say when she found out that it was all a lie? They glanced over at Dal, trying to decide if they should dip into his thoughts or not. "All right, kids, stay close, no sudden moves." Talus marched up the ramp and into the storage bay of the Protostar. Tagras and Chidosa rounded up Zero and the others, leading them in behind her. Zero wobbled nervously as they floated on board. "So where's this chimerium?" Talus demanded, whirling around to face the nervous crew. Only Dal seemed confident. "Locked away in a safe." "Then open it," she snapped. "Sure thing." Dal strolled up to her, then stopped, lifting one finger as if he just remembered something. "Oh, wait a minute." Talus sighed. "What is it now?" She leaned down to him, her eyes glinting. "Did you suddenly remember that you spent all your chimerium? That this whole thing was a big lie?" She bared her tusks. Dal chuckled, taking a step back from her. "Of course not. But Zero's going to need to go up into the ship's ducts to activate the anti-lock on the safe." Talus Blink straightened up. "Which one of you is Zero?" I am." Zero flitted forward, hoping that they didn't come across as frightened. As they did, Dal caught their eye and nodded once, very shortly, and Zero understood instantly. Dal was giving them permission to peek in his head and see his plan. "Oh," Talus studied them. "Let me guess. You're the only one who can fit in the ship's ducts." Yes, I'm afraid so." Zero tried to infuse their voice with the same confidence that Dal spoke with. "It's a protective measure, you understand." As they spoke, Zero let their own thoughts wander over to Dal's. Dal's plan came to Zero in a series of images. Zero going to the vehicle replicator rather than the ducts. Zero replicating a pile of chimerium, then setting it inside a clear wall panel within one of the escape pods. Instantly, Zero understood exactly what Dal hoped would happen. "Fine," Talus said, "but if I get a whiff of anything amiss, and I mean anything, I won't hesitate to kill your friends, one by one." Rock-Talk let out a frightened gasp. Jenkum started to protest. "You wouldn't!" Gwyn cut him off, slapping her hand over his mouth. "Understood," Zero said, hearing their confidence edge out their fear. Talus flicked her wrist dismissively. As Zero flew out of the storage bay and into the corridor of the ship, they heard Tagras barking at the crew to sit down against the wall. "I just hope this plan works out the way Dal expects it to," thought Zero. They flew as quickly as they could down the corridor, trying very hard not to think about Talus's threat to kill their friends one by one. Fortunately, they arrived at the vehicle replicator without any interruption. The replicator hummed with power. Zero moved over to the control panel. "Replicate chimerium," they said, then paused, sick with worry. "Chimerium cannot be replicated," the computer said. Terror ripped through Zero. They thought of the crew lined up against the wall. Gwyn and Dal would be putting on an air of confidence, certainly. Probably Jenkum, too. But Rock-Talk would be terrified. "I know that," Zero said quickly. "I mean replicate a substance that looks like chimerium." The replicator paused for a moment. "Do you wish to replicate false chimerium?" "Yes," Zero cried. "False chimerium. It just has to look good." "Understood." Then, to Zero's great relief, the replicator lit up, and a small pile of chimerium, false chimerium, appeared on the platform. To Zero, it looked like the real thing, glittering in the bright lights of the room. Perhaps Talus wouldn't be able to tell the difference until she and her crew were off the ship. Zero scooped up the false chimerium and tucked it away in one of the escape pods, just as Dal had planned. "Your Medusan friend is taking too long," Talus said to Dal. They just left," Dal cried. Talus huffed her displeasure, then nodded at Chidosa. The Cation immediately snatched Murph out of Rock-Talk's arms. "Hey!" Rock-Talk shouted. "What are you doing? Leave him alone!" Murph squirmed against Chidosa's embrace. "Oh, disgusting. It's all slimy," she hissed. "Don't say that about Murph," Rock-Talk snapped. "He is kind of slimy," Jenkum muttered. Rock-Talk smacked Jenkum on the arm. "No sudden movements," Tagras roared, pointing a pulse rifle at them. Rock-Talk went still, her eyes wide. Talus turned to Dal. "If the Medusan is not back in 5... All done." Dal let out a long sigh of relief as Zero zoomed back into the storage bay. Talus turned toward them. "You've activated the anti-lock device?" she said with a sneer. "I did," Zero said pleasantly. "Although only on the first safe on the right." They glanced over at Dal, who nodded. Of course, that had been the escape pod Zero had seen in Dal's mind, but they didn't want to take any chances. "Well, I hope you unlock the one with the chimerium," Talus snapped. "Of course," Zero said. "Why wouldn't I?" Talus grunted in annoyance. "All right, everyone." She clapped her hands together, whirling around to face the crew. "We're going on a little expedition. Line up single file." The crew glanced nervously at one another. Gwyn was the first to stand up. "Come on," she said with a smile. "Everything will be fine." Zero went over to Gwyn's side, settling in place behind her. When Dal walked over to join them, Talus grabbed his arm and pulled him roughly to her side. "Not you," she said. You're coming with me. Dal smiled past his thundering heart. Talus shoved him forward, marching him over to the exit. Dal stiffened when he felt the tip of her phaser stick into his back. Take us to the safes, she said, and don't try anything funny. Dal looked up at her. Have we done anything funny since we got here? Talus had no answer. Dal glanced over his shoulder to check on the others. To his relief, they were being marched along by both Tagras and Shadosa. Good. He needed all three traders to be in one place. Turn left, he said cheerfully as they approached the cross corridor. Talus grunted in acknowledgement. They walked down the corridor without speaking. Dal kept his stride loose and easy, trying not to betray the frantic rhythm of his heartbeat. Talus, at least, seemed to buy it. How much farther? She asked. We're just winding down hallways. Almost there, Dal said. We keep the safe in an unusual location. Talus looked at him, tusks flashing. I don't like unusual. Dal grinned. Look, we're a bunch of kids robbing starships. We've got to think creatively. Her brow furrowed. If this is a trap... It's not a trap, Dal said quickly. But we've had to abandon ship on more than one occasion. So we keep all our safes. He turned abruptly, pulling her into the escape pod room, where we can take them with us if we have to. Talus's two associates dragged the others into the escape pod room. Up against the wall, Tagras ordered. And don't move. Turned to Talus. What's going on here? Why are we in the escape room? Dal held his breath, but Talus just broke into a smile. These kids might deserve more credit than we've given them, she said. Their captain here tells me he keeps all their loot aboard an escape pod. Just like you do, cried Shadosa. Talus shot her a dirty look, and she immediately cowered, ears flat against her head. Hey, great minds, Dal said, nudging her. Enough from you. Which pod is it? First pod on the right. There is a tiny complication, though. Talus whirled toward him, anger flashing across her features. Complication? What sort of complication? I let your Medusan roam the corridors unsupervised. It's nothing, Dal said, peeling himself away from her. Just an additional failsafe to cut down on thievery. Talus arched an eyebrow. Got to have at least 4 people in the pod in order to open the safe, Dal said. Talus stared at him for a long time. Dal gestured back at his crew. Look, I love them, he said, but there's 6 of us, so a majority has always got to be present. I get it, Talus waved her hand. Tagras, Shadosa, leave the kids and get over here. Are you sure? Tagras frowned down at the crew. They're rather feisty. Yes, I'm sure, Talus sighed. As Tagras and Shadosa stepped across the room, Dal caught Gwyn's eye, then jerked his head very slightly in the direction of the escape pod's emergency release. She nodded in understanding. Dal spun around and strode up to the first escape pod on the right, activating the doors with one fluid motion. They hissed open, and Talus let out an excited gasp. The false chimerium that Zero had replicated was sitting in plain sight, tucked into a panel on the wall, an energy shield keeping it safe. Right this way, Dal said, bowing graciously. Look at that, Talus said. You kids weren't lying. And she nodded at Shadosa, her voice going hard. You first. Oh, I assure you there's no trap, Dal said. I don't care what you say, Talus snapped back. Shadosa, get in there. Her whiskers quivering, the Cation stepped into the escape pod. When nothing happened, Talus nodded at Tagras, who went in, peering around the space. That doesn't really look like a safe, he grumbled. Chimerium just out in the open like that? Zero figured you'd want to see it, Dal said. He turned to Talus, gestured expansively. Ladies first. You're not as charming as you think you are, she said coldly as she stepped across the boundary. Oh, but I am. Dal winked at her and slammed his fist down on the door's control panel, locking all 3 of the traders inside. Now, he shouted. which was completely unnecessary because Gwyn was already activating the emergency release. The escape pod moaned as its safety grip sprung free. Dal stepped back, grinning. Taylor's face appeared in the tiny view window, her expression twisted up in fury. But whatever she was screaming, Dal couldn't hear. And then he couldn't see her either, as the escape pod flung itself up into Odaro's atmosphere, back to the market where it was programmed to land.